Hey, welcome to Birthing the Gifts. I am clinical psychologist Dr. Kyla Holmes, and here at Birthing the Gifts, we provide a safe and compassionate space to grow your God-given gifts. In this interview series, we discuss the process of giving birth to your gifts. Today, we have with us Dr. Chelsea Wakefield. Thank you for joining us, Chelsea.
Good
I
to be here.
appreciate your time and just sharing with us today about your process. And usually, what I like to do is just to say a little bit about kind of how I know the person that I'm interviewing and give just my kind of my personal heart. So it's not like a formal bio or introduction in that way. It's just kind of to give my heart in terms of why I was led to ask that person to be a part of this interview series. So, like for me, the way I found out about you, of course, is through professional organizations and through the Arkansas Psychological Association. And of course, you presented for us at least a couple of times. And so through that, I think I was just, and I think I've told you this, but like personally, the content that you provided, I think impacted me in some ways just as much personally as it did professionally in terms of like how you present, put in just wonderful language to very complex processes and dynamics that can happen in relationships. And I could just see your passion for it. I think that's really what stood out is your passion for it. And when I launched this series, I said, I'm really gonna ask Chelsea to be a part of this because I know it's a story behind that. I know it has to be a process for somebody to be able to present that passionately and that knowledgeably about what they do. So thank you for being a part of this interview series. I've been excited about this for a while, so I appreciate you being here. Um, so if you don't mind just saying first, I guess just saying a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do and how you would describe in some ways, like, so this is about your gifts, but just like, yeah, just who you are. How would you present who you are?
Well, if this was an elevator speech, I would tell you that I am a part-time academic over at UAMS, where I teach future clinicians about relationships and psychodynamic psychotherapy and how to work with families and couples, and also sexuality, which is a strong interest of mine. And then I have a practice outside of UAMS where I see mostly couples, a few individuals, work with complex relationship issues. And then the third thing I do, which I'm really quite passionate about, I do an outside workshop called the Luminous Woman Weekend. And in that weekend, with a group of people, a circle of women, we explore the identity of being female. And we look at some of the key feminine archetypes that women typically live into. And we look at what would happen if you expanded your story or your archetypal profile in terms of bringing your gifts to the world and living more deeply into who you were born to be. So those are
Mm,
the three domains that I
uh,
live in. I live in the domain of the mind. In teaching, I live in the domain of the mind and the heart and the soul, really, in my clinical practice. And then I really live in the domain of the heart and the soul when I'm working in those weekend workshops with women.
oh, wow. That's amazing. It's a lot. I feel like it's a lot that can be discussed in each one of those domains. But if we could first start with, so when we talk about the process, a lot of times I wonder, like, where do people get started with it? So if you don't mind, because I was just going to say with mental health. So with the questions that I have here, that's the term that I use to describe it. But I feel like what you're talking about sounds more holistic than mental health. I feel like
Mhm.
in some ways. So that's just the word I put on it. But if you could let us know, when did you know that being a part of people's healing journey or them being all of who they were going to be or were designed to be, or mental health, whatever word that you would put to it, when did you know that that was going to be a part of your journey and your path?
Well, when I look back, I realized that I was always trying to help people out of difficult situations, even in high school. And I
Okay.
was a person that people came and talked to about problems at home, um, just problems with life, problems with school. I went to college and I was also a musician. And most people don't know that I actually worked my way through graduate school teaching piano and voice. And while I
Mm,
was doing that, I did a lot of family work. I was in
mm,
people's homes because I was a traveling teacher, and I
mhm,
saw a lot of family life and did a lot of conversations with kids about their lives and their relationships with their parents and things of that
mm,
sort. I have, in my early 30s, I lived in New York City and I worked for a company called Northern Telecom. I was in marketing there. And it was very interesting because when I left New York, I left New York to go back to graduate school. And
mm,
people had been telling me all along the way, they'd been saying comments like, this is not social work.
mm.
This is sales. This is not social work.
Okay.
Um, and I just started getting the message from people that I did not belong in my 20s. I did not belong in the business world. And so
Mm,
eventually I started listening. And then I did some of my own therapy, which really helped me a great deal. And I decided that I wanted to do this work. So
mhm,
it corresponded with the failure of my first marriage, which is part of how I became interested in working with couples. And so I moved back in with my mother, as a matter of fact, when I was around 29 or 30 years old, and I started back to school. And
mm,
it was a thrilling time for me to be able to get back into an educational environment and to really find what a lot of people talk about, my tribe, to be
mhm,
with people who felt like I did about wanting to help people, about really wanting to understand the underlying factors in the troubled people's lives and how you might be
mhm.
able to assist them.
Okay. Wow. And I'm just kind of jotting down some notes because what I like to do is just kind of go back and understand some pieces of their process and then kind of come back to where you left off. You said at one point you were in you know what? Let me actually go back a little bit further. Let me go back a little bit further because I was about to talk about the business world, so I'm going to come to that. But if I could go back, because you mentioned earlier about high school, and the
Mhm.
reason why I'd like to kind of focus some on people in their early days is because usually when I have these conversations with people about their process, usually they can go back to something even in their childhood or where they noticed or somebody else noticed that this is in you. Like this is a part of you. So, what would you say that? Well, I don't even know like what language you would put to that about why and how people even came to you and you found yourself in these conversations even in high school. Because I wonder was something in you already being stirred up, cultivated
Yes.
that prepared you for now. So what language would you put to what was happening, you think, at that time?
I think I've always had a really deep caring for people, and I've been
Mhm.
easy to talk to.
Okay.
I've been very non-judgmental
Hmm.
and very supportive, and I've always had a big world view. If I could really distill a lot of what I do is helping people to transcend small stories. In
Hmm.
other words, they have an idea of who they are, how life works, um, and the story is too small. It's too small for the size of their souls. It's too small for what they were put here on earth to do. So I try to find that light
Hmm.
inside, that little kindling of something that might be a thread for them to follow, and then
Hmm.
encourage people to follow that light into something that is more fulfilling and also a gift to the world. Because I
Hmm.
really believe that we all do have a gift to the world. And there's a phrase in Judaism called tikkun olam, which
Hmm.
means to heal the world.
Hmm.
And I really like the idea that each of us has something that we can contribute that will maybe not heal the whole world, but it
Hmm.
certainly will make a contribution to the people whose lives we touch. And we can't
Right.
change the world, but if
Mhm,
everybody just did their part, just did
mhm,
their part with their community, their families, their communities, I
mhm.
think that most of the world's problems would be solved if everyone was in a giving space and really tapped into their gifts.
Wow. Wow. Yes, yes, absolutely, 100%. And it seems like you're saying that gift, you had that in high school. Do you feel like that was something that you came into the world with? Or do you feel like that was modeled for you, cultivated even in early, even before high school?
I think that my mother's family is
Mhm.
filled with teachers.
Okay.
Lots and lots of teachers on that genogram.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and a significant amount of struggle in my grandparents' lives. Um,
Mhm.
they came to this country as youngsters,
Mhm.
and they had from Holland, and they had a hard time getting
Yeah.
started. So there's a lot of education in my family tree, a big emphasis on education and on
Mm.
giving. So if you look at um, of the five women in my grandmother's children, four became teachers, and the
Mhm.
male became he ran a nursing home, and so there's a
Mhm.
lot of giving culture in my
Yeah.
family.
Mhm.
And but I do believe I dropped down on this earth
Mm.
with um, a, a pathway before me. And I'm a little bit of what you might call an essentialist. I believe I have a very Jungian orientation where I believe that we each have an inner compass, and we actually have a reason that we're here on earth. And part of our job as humans is to discover why we're here and to get our outer lives in alignment with our inner lives and that inner compass. And when I am teaching mental health professionals, I really try to emphasize that unless the inner life and the outer life are aligned, that
Mhm.
person will always be anxious and they'll always be
Mm.
depressed. And it won't matter how much medication you give them, they're never going to be okay. So you
Mhm.
really, that part of the work that I do with people is to figure out the goodness of fit in terms of,
Mhm.
is the life that you're living the life you were meant to be living? And if it's
Yeah.
not, what's the pathway to get that integrated?
Yeah. Ooh, I love that. I love it. What is it, if you could unpack that a little bit, especially for our listeners, some maybe, folks who are in mental health and they would totally kind of see that, they would resonate with that for their personal lives and even folks that they work with. But what if somebody where that's a new concept to them? Do you mind kind of unpacking that? Like, why would that be that if somebody's outer lives doesn't align with what's going on internally? How is that, and why is that creating anxiety or depression for people?
I think people feel it in their bodies. I
Mm.
think that there's literally when we're not where we're supposed to be and we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, not online with our deepest purpose, that
Mhm.
we feel a sense of restlessness
Yeah.
inside and agitation.
Mm.
And in this Western culture, we're not very attuned to our bodies. We
Mm.
don't really pay attention to when that sense of alignment and that core of feeling settled and, like, this is good, this is right
Mm.
in our
Mhm.
bodies. And so a lot of what's taught today in graduate schools, both social work programs and master's in counseling and psychology programs, is really centered around cognitive behavioral therapy, which has a whole bevy of really excellent tools. And I use cognitive behavioral therapy to challenge, thought distortions and awfulizing and, all of the things that we learn in terms of
Mm.
how thoughts create feelings, et cetera. But
Mhm.
there's something deeper that needs to be looked at.
Mhm.
And, it's interesting because Deb Dana, who is a teacher of polyvagal theory, which is a very embodied theory, she talks about glimmers. And I
Mhm.
really like that term because when someone is talking about their lives and I'm watching them and all of a sudden I see their eyes light up and a smile come across their face,
Mhm.
I always try to pause them around that and say, what's happening right now?
Yeah.
You're talking about something and you're lighting up. What
Mhm.
is happening for you right now? Because they
Mhm.
may be just skittering by something that is the path of their life or the answer to a problem, and they're thinking, thinking, trying to
Mhm.
figure something out. And
Mhm.
they're missing something that is a guidance from within.
Mhm.
Now, the thing about guidance from within, there's a whole thing right now where people say, shouldn't I trust my feelings? And I think that feelings should be trusted if you observe over time that those feelings are based in something good and healthy. Because
Mm-hmm.
we also have a lot of feelings around triggers and complexes and things, the unresolved stuff and hurts and scripts
Yeah.
that were handed to us by others. So
Mm-hmm.
all that has to be sorted through in the
Yeah.
search for who were you born to be? And
Absolutely.
yeah, so following the
Yeah.
glimmers.
Okay, the glimmers, because I did want to go back to that language, but I like what you just sorted through there. And it sounds like, Chelsea, if somebody was going to, um, like you said, try to trust their feelings, what you just outlined right there is marvelous, deep insight in revelation to be able to tease apart what of our feelings is based in something healthy and whole and helpful to us, and what is based essentially in trauma and, like you said, scripts that other people have given us, something that we shouldn't and or wouldn't be helpful for us to follow. So that would take, it sounds like, high level self-awareness to be able to get there. So I'm glad that you're talking about it beyond like trusting our feelings, definitely being aware and mindful of them, but really having a deeper level of insight and guidance to how it is that we're going to live our life. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think over time, people can sort out
Mm-hmm.
whether I'm feeling really emotionally activated in that problematic way, or am
Mm-hmm.
I feeling inspired and internally
Yeah.
aligned in a
Mm-hmm.
way that becomes more of a calling, more of an
Mm-hmm.
opening door?
Mm-hmm.
It's time
Yes.
to learn that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I love it. I love it. If you could say a little bit, so when you say those glimmers, would you say, and you mentioned Deb Dana, is what she's saying and what you're saying that those glimmers would be that moment that you realize that, or that moment where you have maybe a feeling or maybe some reaction, some internal experience that what's happening with me now is a reflection of the alignment of my kind of inner world and outer world. Is that what's meant by the glimmers?
Yeah, well, she has a whole bit of work, but let me just talk in terms of when people light up. I
Okay.
like to pay attention to that because we just operate out of our thinking so much of the time, and a lot of our thinking is really distorted. And then
Mhm,
it leads to a lot of feelings, and then we end
mhm,
up taking actions that aren't really sourced in some sort of a purposeful direction, but it's
mhm,
just defending or trying to obtain something that seems incredibly important for some reason, but might
mhm.
not actually be fulfilling in the long run.
Yes.
And I mean,
Mhm,
that's where addictions are coming from, is,
mhm.
let's do this right now because I'm going to take care of a feeling I'm having, get my anxiety
Yeah,
down. But the cost
absolutely.
in the long run is big.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I do want to go back to something that you were talking about. Or that you really been talking about this idea of, I guess if the proper word would be kind of a misalignment in what's going on internally and then externally. So I want to connect this with something that you said earlier. You said something about not belonging in the business world. So I want to kind of connect this conversation that we're having with basically this idea, is what we're doing aligning, essentially it sounds like you're saying, with our purpose, with our values, the thing that makes us light up, our gift package. So I guess I'm wondering, is that what you're saying was happening for you in that moment when you were in the business space, that it was something about that that wasn't aligning for you, or how would you describe that?
I would say that that definitely was not a lot. I was getting a lot of feedback, because
Okay.
not negative feedback, but people were
Okay.
telling me what I was good at.
Okay.
They were saying things like, you're really good at team building.
Mm.
You can help people get along and kind of like motivate them to do stuff. They also told me you're good at teaching, which was a part of, when I was teaching music lessons. I
Mm-hmm.
know I'm a good teacher because I can relate. I really
Mm-hmm.
connect with my students, and I try to figure out how they want to learn, what would be most salient for them. So,
Mm-hmm.
even in teaching piano, I didn't have kids running scales. I found out what would light them up about music, and then I would
Mm,
teach them that.
mhm,
So in terms of, and I did some performing earlier in my life as a musician and a singer, and I was looking through some old profiles a while ago, and the phrase on it was that this is what was said about me. She takes people through the mysteries and wonders of the human heart. And so essentially, if we get back to essence, I've been doing that my whole life. And that's
mm,
what I'm still doing, is taking people through the mysteries and wonders of the human heart and helping them discover themselves, helping them get beyond the egoic struggles.
mm.
And when I talk about ego, I'm talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how very important it is that we develop healthy egos, like who am I? What are the rules by which I live? What are my values? What's important to me? Where are my boundaries? Those are all egoic things. But when I talk about that inner compass, it's something
Mhm,
beyond the ego. It's
mm,
something that the ego can actually interfere with. So when I jumped off the business train and went back to school, I didn't know if that was a good idea. I mean, I had a
mhm,
really good job and I took a
mhm,
big cut in pay, but
mm,
it felt right. It felt good and right, and it had been indicating that direction had been calling to me in a long time. And I finally had the courage to jump off into the unknown and do it. And I think that's part of people actually living into their destiny, is sometimes you
mhm,
got to jump off into the unknown.
mhm. If you don't mind talking about that, like I love how you say courage and jumping into the unknown. Was that like scary for you? Was it hard? If so, where did you find that courage? How did you navigate that time in life?
I think that again, that's something that I've always had a little bit of an adventurer in me who wants
Mhm,
to um, explore things that are out there that other people wouldn't
mhm,
necessarily do.
mhm,
Um, I just knew I had enough confidence in myself because of the feedback that I've been given, and also just really a sense of calling.
mhm,
I just felt deeply that I would be good at this, that I'd kind of been doing it my whole life, but just without any professional training. And
mhm,
that if I had the professional training, I knew I could make a go of it. Um,
mhm,
what's been interesting about my professional training is that um, it's been ongoing. My hope,
mhm.
and if I look at the last 25 years of practicing and look at my continuing education that I turn in every year for my required continuing education, there'd be like 40 units required and I'd have 100, because
Wow. Okay.
every time I bumped into a limitation in my practice, I would think to myself, somebody knows how to do this. And I'm going to go find that someone and study with them. So I would find
Mhm,
that someone and go study with them. And sure
mhm,
enough, I was able to help my clients. And then I would bump
mhm,
into another something.
mhm,
And I would say, somebody knows how to do this, and I'm going to go
mhm,
study with them. And then I would go study with them. So I've got a ridiculous amount of training and certifications that over the years, and when you're talking about when I present, I I think I have a gift of synthesis. So I
okay.
can glean the pearls from a lot of different modalities, and they're organized. I do have an organizing structure, which is somewhat psychodynamic, but I
Mm,
can link. It's kind of like the structure, and then all these pearls, these kind of like link here, link there. This is
mhm,
this is the same thing as that, just different language. Let me
mhm,
explain how the underlying principles of what
mhm.
they are talking about are the same, but this
Right.
person has just developed it with different language and coming at it from a different direction. So
Mhm,
that's one of the reasons why I enjoy teaching, is because I think I can tie together a lot of different systems and modalities into a cohesive whole.
Which is very much needed when I think sometimes students, and I find myself, because we're, like you said, we're lifelong learners. So sometimes when I'm learning about any kind of idea or concept, and you see all these different, like you say, modalities or frameworks or models, and it's just like, okay, how do we synthesize this? How do we bring this together? Because it very much seems like they're talking about a similar concept and using some just using different language. So how do we bring this together in a way that we can actually use and apply,
Yeah.
especially if we're working with clients? Yeah. What would you say for that time of your life when you were in the business world and then realized that, like I'm getting this feedback, it's areas, it's gifts that I have, and now I'm feeling this calling to go into this direction. What would you say you learned from that time about you, about, I don't know, the world, humans, just anything? What did you take away? What would be your takeaways?
One thing that I would really emphasize is just because you are successful at doing something doesn't mean it's what you're supposed to be doing. And I think that's a really important thing for people who go through entire systems of education, like maybe they become an attorney or something, or a doctor. I mean, think about the years to become a doctor, and they discover at some point in time, this is not what I want to be doing.
Yeah.
And I know people who have jumped off the track of that after many years in investment of time and money and gone and done other things. I'm thinking
Hmm.
about one woman I talked to, um, oh gosh, maybe about 10 or 12 years ago, and she was a pediatrician. And she
Hmm.
realized that what she really wanted to do is work with children in therapy. And
Hmm.
so she was 50 years old and she went back to get a master's degree in counseling so that
Wow.
she could work with kids as a therapist. And think about the humility that that required for her, and that, like, what are you doing? Are you crazy? That kind of a
Wow.
thing. So
Hmm.
I saw her several years after she'd gotten her master's degree, and she
Hmm.
was so happy because she was
Wow.
doing what she felt called to do.
Mm. Wow, I love it. And so it looked like her happiness, it was that alignment. It's like
Mhm.
she was experiencing that alignment that allowed her to really be happy and I'd imagine fulfilled and satisfied with life in a way that
She
that
just couldn't do
just
as a
yeah,
pediatrician.
exactly,
She
exactly.
didn't
Yeah.
hate being a pediatrician. It just
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the fullness of who she was born to be.
Mm, the fullness, the fullness. So it seems like the fullness of who you were born to be, you started to move into that direction after being involved in the business world. What direction did you go into after that? Like what did you like start graduate training at that point, or what did you
I,
pursue? Yeah.
I got my master's in social work,
Okay.
and I really appreciate that as the first level of training that I
Mm-hmm.
got, and then the follow-up training after that was so very important. What I liked and appreciate about the master's in social work is it really gives you a worldview of people and environment. It
Mm-hmm.
really emphasizes that people are shaped by their environments. And so in doing counseling, you're not just dealing with that individual, you're dealing with their history, their culture, their economic situation, a whole bunch of factors that cause them to be
Mm-hmm.
who they are. So I
Mm-hmm.
really valued that. And then after that, I was in, so this is what I really consider the scaffolding of my
Mm-hmm.
clinical world. I was, for 7 years, I was in a training and supervision program in transactional analysis, which is a very old psychotherapy, but it deals with the formation of people. We can call them scripts or schemas. And it also
But,
is
but do
very,
you mind unpacking that a little bit, scripts and schemas? What can you mind do you mind defining that a little bit for people
well,
listening?
there are a lot of kind of default modes that people can
Mm-hmm.
fall into, like be perfect, be
Mm-hmm.
pleasing, be strong. Things
Mm-hmm.
like that, that can be the script from people. It's like if you have to be perfect, if that's where your identity and your value is grounded in being perfect, you're going to be in trouble across your whole
Mhm.
life because nobody's perfect. Likewise,
Right.
nobody's pleasing all the time. And pleasers, as we
Mhm.
well know as mental health professionals, are often in trouble
Mhm.
because they're focused on what others want and they don't really know who they are, who they were
Mhm.
born to be, what their gifts are, and how they might develop them,
Yes.
particularly,
Mhm.
when I early on in my life, even in terms of following a music career, my father wanted me to be a concert pianist.
Mm.
I did not want to be a concert pianist. I did not want to spend hours and hours in a practice room alone with the piano. That was
Okay.
way too lonely for someone who likes connection.
Mhm.
So I didn't do that. And
Mhm.
my mother wanted me to be a teacher like everybody else. And eventually, of
Wow.
course, I became one, but on my own
Mm.
terms.
Right.
So being perfect or being strong, you meet people sometimes in life that can't admit weakness.
Mm.
They present a strong persona. They can't ask for help. They just have a
Mhm.
be strong driver in them. So those
Mm.
are all aspects of
Mhm.
transactional analysis. And um, the drama triangle comes from that
Mm.
world with the persecutor, rescuer, and victim. I use that a
Mhm.
lot in my couples work and looking at, where are you caught and how are you moving around that triangle?
Mhm.
Um, and the looking at the ego state that people are operating from. And in
Mhm.
that modality, there we can think about people being in nurturing or critical parent, in healthy adult, or in vulnerable child, or adapted child, we could call it, or happy
Mhm.
child,
Mhm.
spontaneous free child. And
Mhm.
so of course we're always looking for people to operate as adults from a healthy adult where they think things through and they understand how the world works, but housing and always acknowledging the energy and the importance of those little children that are housed within
Mm.
us. And I've
Mhm.
always thought about that as a whole bevy of children. They're
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
nesting dolls. They're all sorts. There's the
Mhm.
13-year-old and the 8-year-old and the 5-year-old and the
Mhm.
2-year-old. And they
Mhm.
still rumble around and they create emotions and they drive
Mm.
us to do things, which again
Mhm.
is don't always trust your feelings because it might be your
Mm.
inner 13-year-old. So,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah.
critical parent is,
Mhm.
those of us that have really strong critical parents, if you are also trying to be perfect, that
Mhm.
inner critic inside is always on your back and never
Mm.
letting you rest. And
Mhm.
so people relate to each other. And in my couples work, I still think about this in terms of what is the interior state that one person is relating to the other in? Has this
Mm.
person become like a judgmental father and now we've got like a scared little girl over here? Or do we have
Mm.
two adults who are really trying to figure out what are we trying to create here? What is the life we're trying to really form? How do we best
Mm.
love each other as adults,
Right.
not as children, not as judgmental, or even nurturing parents, because that can be a
Mhm.
relationship problem too when you've got a nurturing
Mm.
parent and a needy partner.
Mhm.
Not
Yeah. So
sustainable over time.
not sustainable. So would you say in the couples work that you do, and I'm pretty sure that it's several ways that we can kind of, well, several different topics that we can get into with this. But I think what I want to ask related to that is, would you say you see that in the couples work a lot, where you have people that are not operating from those healthy adult places, that you have those different inner children or different parts of them that's relating to each other, and is that part of what you do in the couples work, is help them to realize that dynamic or have awareness around that?
Yes, it's called
Mhm.
growing up.
Okay.
And I
I
often
love it.
say, I don't say that to people. I don't say you need to grow up, but I'm
Right.
aware that when people are viciously fighting, there are no adults in the room. There
Mm-hmm.
are no adults in the room. And usually it's just two vulnerable children trying to get
Mm-hmm.
the other person to meet their needs or be the person that they need them to be. And the other person can't do that because they have needs and feelings. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're just bouncing back and forth, demanding that the other person be something that they can't be. And
Mhm.
so there's a lot of personal, when I'm working with couples, I'm always thinking about personal work and interpersonal
Okay.
work. And both of
Mhm.
them are required. And almost all problems in relationships are transcended by growth.
Ah, I love it. So growth has to happen. Growth is
Mhm.
going to have to happen for there to be any progress. When did you realize that couples work is something that you wanted to be involved in? When? How did that come about? Why did that come about?
Well, I watched my parents' marriage come apart after 29 years of marriage. And it was really tragic, mostly because what really needed to happen is my father was in a clinical depression post heart attack, which we know
Mhm.
happens a lot for people now.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, this is probably why the subject of my master's thesis became the subject of the master's thesis. But I was raised in a somewhat religious, historical environment, and he went to his pastor, and his pastor told him that he probably had unconfessed sin in his life. And my
Mhm.
father was a good man. And he searched and searched and searched and tried to figure out like what was the unconfessed sin that would be leading to the heart attack and the depression. And he
Mhm.
couldn't find it. And then it got so bad. And one day he got up and walked out the door,
Mhm.
and there was a divorce. And he
Mhm.
spun for a long time. Both of them
Wow.
spun. Both my mom and dad had a hard time after the divorce. And even though I believe that they loved each other till the day they died, they could not put it back together.
Mhm.
And they both grew, but they also suffered. And the family came apart. And, anytime a family comes apart, I was in college, but it was
Mhm.
still hard on everybody.
Of
And
course.
so that was a history of number one, being interested in how could mental health help people where religion cannot? And how do you divide
Mhm.
those two? And my master's degree was actually clergy as a community mental health resource, what they can offer and where they fail. And that was my master's thesis. And so I've
Wow.
always been interested in the intersection between, we know that the first place people turn if they're in a church is to their pastors or ministers or rabbis when they have trouble. And
Mhm.
often those people are not really trained to help them. I often get today, in this present time, many couples who come to see me who have been to their pastors to seek marital help, and the help that they've gotten has not been helpful.
Okay.
Things
Wow.
like you two need to get along, or you just need to forgive her, or you just need to forgive him and let it go. And the problems are never really looked at, um, or you need to just do what he says because he's the head of the household. And
Wow.
lots of stuff that is just not helpful for people in the 21st century. And
It's
I
not
think,
him. Yeah.
yeah. So
Mhm.
that's a little bit of the history. And then
Well, can I
years
add
later,
something
sure,
before we go past it? I just want to stay with just for a little bit. And
that's
part
fine.
of this, Chelsea, is this is like you really touched on something there. This is something that's a personal interest of mine, and I feel like it lines up with a lot of what we'll focus on within birth and the gifts, and it is this intersection between, and I'm going to intentionally use these words: faith, spirituality, religion, and mental health and emotional wellness, right? So I noticed the words that you use, and I just want to just kind of touch on that a little bit. So when you say like, how can like this was part of you say your thesis or your dissertation? Did
My
you
master's thesis, my
your
dissertation
master's
was
thesis?
on sexuality.
Okay, wow, okay,
Okay,
that's another
that's for
conversation.
later.
Okay, wow, yes, we're definitely gonna get there. So, but when you talked about in your thesis, and as you're talking about now, it's like how can mental health be helpful when religion is not? Are you kind of focusing on with that? Like, I guess I'm wondering how you're defining that. Because in what you just said, it sounds like is it the people like organize the religion and the people within like faith leaders who are trying to be helpful in these situations. So, like where faith leaders or clergy can't be helpful, where now licensed mental health professionals can. Is that kind of how that was defined?
Yes, and I
Okay.
do believe that if my father had been given a good antidepressant during that period of time, that marriage would have been saved.
Wow.
I
Okay.
really believe that,
Wow.
because he was in a clinical depression
Mm-hmm.
and he
Wow.
eventually came out of it, but the marriage was over by then.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Wow. So that was kind of, and you said that, so that being your personal experience, you feel like kind of sparked a research interest and then a desire to kind of really make progress in that area or shed light, bring awareness to that, would you say?
I think it had a lot to do with wanting to really get some good, solid information and skills about the difference between, like what is a depression? How do you
Mm-hmm.
help people who are in depression? And
Mm-hmm.
um, well, to be perfectly honest, I had a lot of anger for a long
Mm-hmm.
time at the church,
Okay.
uh, because I felt that they failed my father. And this is
Mm-hmm.
deeply personal that I'm sharing with you
Okay.
now. But eventually, I really came to understand that they were doing the best that they could with what they knew. And my father was also kind of locked into a world where he would not have thought to seek mental health professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
he was sort of operating with what he knew, as all of us do. But I do believe, and I feel very strongly that there
Mm-hmm.
can be some very important alliances between faith communities and
Yes.
mental health professionals, and where
Yes.
because you know what? Faith is important.
Yes.
And
Yes.
while I don't consider myself at this time in my life a very religious person, I am a very faithful person. And so
Mm-hmm.
even when I talk about that inner compass, I
Yeah.
do think that we are guided often by flashes of inspiration that feel sometimes almost sacred in terms of their
Mm-hmm.
calling, or
Mm-hmm.
that mysterious doors open for us. When we maybe sit in a chair and pray that, God will
Mm-hmm.
help us, or that something will
Mm-hmm.
emerge. And then
Mm-hmm.
suddenly someone appears and a door opens, and we don't really know what that is. In the Jungian world, which I have done a lot of training in the Jungian world, that's called a synchronicity. But in the faith
Mm-hmm.
world, it could be called God working in your life. So
Mm-hmm.
there's different language for these kinds of things. But once I believe that you really have a sense that you were put here on earth for a reason, and that help exists on sometimes a transcendent level or from some sort of wisdom inside that you can find. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
go out, you can go in and you can
Yes.
listen. You can listen really deeply and you can get
Mm-hmm.
guidance there. So the
Mm-hmm.
intersection of religion and
Yes.
mental health, yeah, is been important in my life.
Yes, absolutely. I do appreciate you sharing. And I know when we talk about it's a process, usually it is something very deeply personal that comes from that in people's process. So I appreciate you sharing in a very transparent way. And I also agree that it is something I like personally and professionally value this idea of what does that intersection look like in people's individual lives and at a system level, because I think it's a lot that the faith community can learn from the mental health community and that the mental health community can learn from the faith community. And like you say, really coming together is how can we be partners and collaborate? We might not agree on everything, but how can we be partners and know that, especially if we have a similar goal to see people healthy, well, and whole. And
Mm-hmm.
like you talked about that alignment and living their lives in a way that will bring them that type of deep satisfaction that I would imagine that whatever word people use, that their higher power, their faith, God would want them to experience. So I very much appreciate you sharing that part there. Okay. Yeah, yeah. So from there, so you said years later, after that, after you finished up your thesis, and then where did it go from there?
Well, I was working with this wonderful clinic in Hickory, North Carolina called Crossroads Counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And a wonderful group of clinicians. We had a psychiatrist, a nurse practitioner, and there were about 10 of us.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a lot of adoption and a lot of foster care. So I really got, again, on the insides of people's lives that, particularly in the foster care system, I remember some of these teenage girls in particular that I worked with in those years that I still wonder. It's like, where are they? What are they doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in working with families, we did a lot of wraparound services. Part of what I really loved about that, where you have one therapist with one child, one therapist with another child, and somebody
Mhm.
with the parents. And I often wound up with the parents. And what Carmen McGee and we started a program called Parenting from the Calm Core. And we
Mm.
realized that for a lot of the kids that were really distressed, the real problem was the parents. The parents were, fighting or whatever was going on with the parents. So we started a program with the parents of
Mhm.
these kids with mental health issues. And that was really fun and very helpful to that group of parents that we taught. But over those years, the other clinicians kept saying
Mhm.
to me, you are gifted with the couples.
Ah,
You do
okay.
really, and so I started training. And
Mhm.
once again, went back to, into the training world. And I
Mhm.
started, I could list where I started and where I went, but I have like 4 certifications in 4 different couples therapies. And I've studied probably every one that there is because it's my
Uh-huh.
area of research and interest.
Mhm.
But yes, that was feedback from clients. And people say, well, how can you sit in the room with people who are like high conflict, people who are yelling at each other, people who don't
Mhm.
talk to each other? And
Mhm.
I think what I do is actually comes from kind of a spiritual basis in that I hold the possibility that these 2 people are caught in a story that is too small for them. I
Mhm.
can see the potential of who they could be
Mhm.
together if they would both drop their defenses, do some personal work, because personal reactivity comes from history, and have
Mhm.
some, in my book, The Labyrinth of Love, which
Mhm.
I've got my little labyrinth of love here. This is my
Yes,
last book.
excellent. Mhm.
I talk about the 6 love capacities. And the
Yeah.
first one is commitment, but it's not just commitment to a person, it's to a process of
Mhm.
becoming a couple, which takes
Mhm.
some time and some humility and some of those other love capacities. And then a
Mhm.
commitment to presence. In other words,
Mhm.
no matter what we're going through, I'm staying engaged.
Mhm.
So there's the
Mhm.
commitment, there's the courage that it takes to be a couple, the courage it takes to look at yourself and to face who your partner really is beyond what you projected them to be or hoped them to be. Like
Mhm.
who am I really married to? That kind of
Right.
thing. Which takes a lot of curiosity. Then we have to move
Mhm.
to, Ellen Bader always used to say, you should be curious instead of furious. Curious
Mm.
instead of furious. I love that little phrase because
Mhm.
every time our partner isn't who we want them to be, or they hurt us, or they disappoint us, or they break an agreement, or they go off in some jag that we can't understand, we've got to
Mhm.
get curious. Like, what is going on here? Not like,
Mhm.
what's going on with you, but
Right.
tell me more about what's happening
Yeah.
inside of you. Where did this come from? Why is this important? And so
Like
then we get
genuine curiosity, like not
genuine.
like I'm here to judge or evaluate or but a genuine curiosity
Right.
about what is happening. And I
Exactly. We're
want to
not
understand.
asking questions to corner you or to play lawyer, or
Mhm.
then to get the reason where we are. Ha, I got you now. Not that kind of
Mhm.
curiosity. But
Mhm.
then we get to communication, which so many couples therapies really emphasize. People always come in, they say, we can't communicate with each other. Well, of course
Mhm.
you can't.
Mhm.
Because you got all this other stuff going on. Let's address some of this other stuff, and then you'll
Right,
be able to
right.
communicate.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
there's the communication. So we've got commitment, courage, curiosity, communication. Then we have compassion. And
Mhm.
compassion emerges when we really meet someone at a deep personal level and we start to understand their story. Like, how
Mhm.
did you get to be this way? What's really important to you? Why is this so sensitive? Things of that sort. And if I really
Mhm.
love you, I'm not gonna capitulate and be who you need me to be, but I certainly am going to be compassionate about the
Mhm.
areas that you have tender spots in. And then the
Mhm.
last one is creativity. And creativity is so important because every couple has to create their relationship. It's like no
Yeah.
other relationship. It's these 2 people and they got to
Mhm.
figure it out. So anyway,
Mhm. Yes, no, thank you for sharing that because I was going to ask you some of that at some point. I love your book, The Labyrinth of Love. You can show us one more time because I'm sure people are going to hear that and say, I need to hear more about these 6 C's that she mentioned. Okay, The Labyrinth of Love. You all check out this book. I have that book myself. I read it. I love you have those sticky notes there.
and
That's
the
the book
reason
that you, yeah.
I have
Oh, yeah.
these sticky notes is I've actually just completed a book study group. We did
Ah,
6 weeks plus a bonus section on the
oh,
book with a bunch of couples, and it was so sweet because they really got very open and very vulnerable with each other, and there was a lot of wisdom that got shared. And they each week they would read sections out of the book that touched them. And it was kind of a kick for me because I mean, I wrote the book 2 years ago, then it
mhm,
was published, and I haven't read it since then. So I have
mhm.
forgotten what I wrote. So occasionally someone will read me something out of my book, and I think to myself, that's pretty good.
Right. Like, yes, still agree with that. That's
Oh, who
good.
wrote
Yeah.
that?
Yes, well, that is good. So I encourage folks to check that out. While we're talking about that book, where can people find that book if they would like to get it for themselves?
You can get it from your local bookstore. You can order it there. You can find it on any of the online bookstores. And it's also on Kindle. So if you like Kindle books, you can get it on Kindle. I'm trying to do a book on tape, but that's on my list of things to do so people can listen to it. But I have a lot going on. So
Okay. So it's on the
eventually,
list. It's on the list. Yeah,
it's on the
eventually
list.
when you get to that. Yeah, if I could ask this for you. So it seems like as a part of your process, when you were going through, you were in your master's program, doing your clinical work afterwards and so forth, and then it was another time in your life of kind of receiving that feedback of saying, man, working with these couples is a part of your gift package. And so it seemed like from there you did what you do and you said, I'm gonna learn about that. How can I learn about that?
Mhm.
So if you could say a little bit about, well, there's a couple of questions I have. I'm going to ask this and then go back to something else. What made you, you mentioned the certifications. Could you say a little bit about what made you pursue the certifications that you did pursue and how that helped to shape how you approach couples work? I know you kind of mentioned it some in talking about the book, but anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I started by studying Gottman, and I found that he wrote a lot of really important stuff. I am not certified in Gottman, but I've done a lot of Gottman reading and
Mhm,
internalizing. And then I moved into Sue Johnson's work, emotionally
mhm,
focused couples therapy.
mhm,
And what's interesting about studying these different modalities, and that is a good couples therapy, by the way, that's a really good couples therapy. What I found is that each of them had a limitation. So I would bump into some sort of a limitation where I was like, there's something about this that doesn't quite work. Like in Gottman's work, he can tell you what makes couples, like why couples succeed and why they fail. And
mhm,
but what Gottman initially missed, which he's now incorporating, is that when people are activated, particularly in their attachment patterns, they
mhm.
can't regulate and they can't do all the good things that he lists in his books. So I wanted to
Okay.
know, like, how do you help people to regulate so that they can relate? And so I started
Okay.
studying
Yes.
attachment, which is Sue Johnson's work. I did the
Well,
first
can I,
level.
well, before you go into the other one, if you could just say a little bit about that, because I think that's a powerful piece I wouldn't want people to miss, because you said they have to regulate before they relate, which is
Yes.
very important, just based in brain science and a lot of what we know about how we operate. So, but if you could say a little, because you also said that people have to learn, especially in couples work, people have to learn how to regulate, especially when they're activated in attachment patterns. If you could just unpack that just a little bit, how would we know, or somebody would know if they are activated in their attachment patterns? What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so one of the most valuable certifications I got was actually the schema couples therapy, which is
Okay.
based on schema. It's a whole work of psychotherapy. It's actually, to me, one of the best psychotherapies around, because it was originated in cognitive behavioral because Jeff Young worked with Beck in New York City, the
Mhm,
originator. And then he realized that there were limitations where when people couldn't regulate, they couldn't cognate.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so
Yes.
he went back and grabbed pieces of transactional analysis and pieces of Gestalt with two-chair work and really started looking at how emotional experiences template us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that in attachment theory, we're looking at how our early experiences literally create neural wiring, which then gets set off in intimate relationships because intimate relationships feel like family. And so our early lives begin to, I in my book, I talk about it's kind of like the silt at the bottom of the lake that it doesn't get stirred up till you walk through it. Well, in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship, now you're walking through it. And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden it gets murky because all this historical stuff starts to stir up and you're kind of like, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I didn't feel this way when we
Mm-hmm.
were dating or,
Mm-hmm.
at the start of our relationship, but suddenly you seem scary or suddenly I feel insecure or young or, we descend into one of our younger selves. And so some people get really anxious because their
Mm-hmm.
history is of abandonment. So they
Mm-hmm.
have an abandonment in Jungian world, what we call it a complex. In the
Mm-hmm.
schema world, we call it a schema. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a template that's literally in their neural wiring that
Mm-hmm.
opens a little file cabinet and downflow the neural chemicals into the body. And now
Mm-hmm.
my whole body is feeling anxious. Like, do you still love
Mm-hmm.
me? Are you mad at me? Are
Mm-hmm.
you came home late? Are you having an affair? All these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
questions that get stirred up in people who have an anxious attachment pattern. And
Mm-hmm.
what's so difficult about that is, let's say the person is like a totally wonderful partner, but you
Mm-hmm.
can wear a person out if you're always saying something's wrong. We need to
Mm-hmm.
sit down and talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Like,
you don't treat me the way I don't think you love me anymore.
mm-hmm.
I don't like the way that you were talking to that woman at the party. Are you involved with her? So there's
Mm-hmm.
jealousies and insecurities that can wear
Mm-hmm.
a partner out.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
anxious people sometimes
Mm-hmm.
pair with people who have an avoidant attachment pattern. And
Mm-hmm.
people who have an avoidant attachment pattern are fearful of being overwhelmed by the demands and emotions of others. So
Mm-hmm.
when you get someone who's very emotional paired
Mm-hmm.
with an avoidant person, you literally
Mm-hmm.
have a couple that's galloping across the landscape. You've got the
Mm-hmm.
anxious person chasing and the
Mm-hmm.
avoidant person saying, my gosh, just give me some space.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really difficult pairing. So I have a lot of couples over the years that I've worked with who have that pairing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I explain to them that what's happening is they're actually just operating out of their nervous systems, which
Mm-hmm.
are formed by history and have gotten activated in an intimate relationship, because they'll say things like, this only happens with you. This doesn't happen at work. It doesn't happen with my friends. It only happens with you. Well,
Yes,
of
yes.
course, because this is the most important person in your world. Feels like
Mm-hmm.
family, activates early stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So just in
Okay.
helping people to learn to recognize when those patterns and those systems of activation get going in them, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can learn personal skills for soothing and calming,
Yes.
and helping
Yes.
the partners work together to be compassionate with
Mm-hmm.
each other, so they don't activate the other person by things that they could change, where they could
Mm-hmm.
be more sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And again, being in a couple is not about me being exactly who you need me to be so you won't get upset. That's
Yeah.
not a couple. That's called
Mm-hmm.
codependency and enmeshment.
Mm-hmm.
What it does mean is that I understand you enough as the person I'm sharing my life with to understand why this is scary for you, or
Mm-hmm.
why sometimes I need to just talk for 10 minutes and then be quiet to let you
Yes.
process, because you get overwhelmed and you shut down if I talk and
Mm-hmm.
talk and talk and talk.
Right.
So our Stantak talks about it beautifully. He says that for people who have those patterns, a secure attachment can be earned. And when you
Mm-hmm.
earn it, you get a brain upgrade.
Wow. Oh, I
So
love that. Who is that?
that's
Who's that?
Stan Tatkin.
Dan
That's
Tacken. Okay.
PACT, PACT, and it's the
Okay.
psychobiological approach to couples
Hmm.
therapy. Yeah.
Oh man, man, I love that. I'm gonna have to just tell the people, for the people listening, that what you just said right there, all of that, I'm gonna tell you, if I can just share and be transparent, that's part really helped me personally, because I love how you put language to that. That helped me to understand more about myself, how I relate in relationships. That's one, and I think so many people, it's like, when as I would hear you talk about that and what you have in your books, I just think, man, people need this knowledge. People need this knowledge. This has to be out there, because I think it helps people to understand more about why they get kind of dysregulated, anxious, uneasy, distressed, why and how that shows up in relationships, in some relationships and not others, and then really what to do about it. So I'm glad. I'm just going to kind of rewind back to what you were saying, because you were talking about why you kind of pursued the different certifications. So I appreciate you unpacking that some more, because I totally agree with that. That I imagine in any type of therapy, especially couples work, it has to be attention paid to those highly dysregulated moments. And then what do you do when people can't access all of what's going on in their thinking brain, in the thinking part of the brain? They just can't access that because they're not regulated, right? They're not regulated. They can't relate. And then when I talk to parents about it, then they can't reason. You can't expect people to be able to reason if they're not regulated and not able to relate. Yeah.
Which is why we can't just yell at little kids when they're
Right.
upset, because nothing goes in.
At all. And I know I'm laughing. I know we do it as humans and adults and everything. It just kind of makes me laugh, because when we think about it and we know better, then we can do better. But it's just like, when you know more, it's just like, it is no way. It just is no way that people can reason, especially little kids. But even adults. I'm sure you've seen it in your office so many times when people get that dysregulated. I mean, maybe you can say more about that. Like, what happens in that moment where people are expecting one person, or they're expecting some reasoning to go on, but it's nowhere, they're just nowhere near, I feel like, capable of doing that in such a dysregulated state. Yeah.
Sometimes I refer one or both of my couples, the partners, out for individual therapy, because if there's a lot of trauma,
Hmm.
um, periodically I'll be working with a couple where the belief is that love will heal everything. So they'll get into a relationship where one person has a big history of trauma, and their belief is that if they just love this person, it'll all be fine. But eventually there's situations that activates the trauma, and then that person withdraws and kind of stonewalls and puts a defensive wall around them, or there's a lot of yelling or
Hmm.
other things. And the person who thought, I just need to love you, is really bewildered because it's just not true.
Hmm.
Um, that whole thing that my parents used to lecture me about over and over, that where you kind of like, does this person come from a good family? Really what they were saying is, does this person come from a good history? And even though there was like a little bit of a sociological thing to that, which I really rebelled against,
Hmm.
I didn't like that. But what I learned, particularly, if I think about my first marriage, where I married a young, temporarily dry alcoholic, and I didn't understand what that meant. And we got pregnant, and
Hmm.
I lost that first baby, but that was the day he started drinking again.
Hmm.
And that was, I learned a lot in that first relationship. This is before I went back to school. This is when I was working in business. But the idea that when people don't do their personal work to heal their histories, that history just travels forward into present time.
Hmm.
And just because we're happy right now and you're not drinking right now, but you've never been to an AA meeting, or you just kind of like decided, oh, I think I'll stop drinking because life's pretty good, and then the minute life gets serious with a wife and a child on the way, the drinking starts again. So all of
Hmm.
those things, that was a very troubled marriage, and I learned a lot in it. But
Okay.
I got some really good advice from someone during that marriage. That
Mhm.
person, because I was hurt and angry and starting to get involved in all the things that couples do when they're in trouble. And
Mhm.
that person said, practice for a better relationship.
Mhm.
You be the kind of person that you want to be for a relationship worth being in.
Mhm.
Don't do the kinds of things that people do, in retaliation. Because there was a number of things that were happening. There was some infidelity on his part, and various things that went on.
Mhm.
It was painful, but I learned a lot,
Okay.
and I think I got stronger because of that good advice.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you don't mind, I appreciate you sharing that. I was gonna circle back to that if you, so I appreciate you sharing that. But you said you learned a lot, and I think when we talk about a process, that's one of the parts of the process that I like to try to highlight is like what were those lessons learned? So, like, is it any of those lessons that you feel like continues to be a part of what helped your gifts to continue to like unfold and manifest?
Yeah, I do have tremendous compassion for
Mhm.
couples who have difficult histories,
Okay.
because they're trying to make a life together, and they've got all this material that's activating. So
Mhm.
I'll do a lot of work with regulation, and the kinds of things that we need to do. um, how do we stay grounded? And one of the things, for people who work with me, they know that if it's a really troubled couple, I'll do a lot of interrupting, and I'll say things like, now you two can do that at home,
Okay.
but here we're going to learn to do something different.
Right. I love it.
You
Mhm.
two can do, like, if you want to do
Yeah.
all that at
I
home,
love
then that's,
yeah.
but you're
Yeah.
kind of here to not do that.
Right,
So let's
right.
not do that.
Let's not do that. I love
And
it.
I have a certain amount of alpha and
Mhm.
I tell people when they come to work with me, it's like, I am going to interrupt you. It's not because
Mhm.
I'm rude. It's because I know you're here to learn to do things differently. So
Mhm.
in the middle, in the flow of the difficulty, we're going to stop, and
Mhm.
I'm going to have each of you like begin within, which is in my book. It's like, what's going on with me right now? What am I
Mhm.
projecting? How am I
Mhm.
activated? What is it that I actually want in this moment?
Mhm.
Because a lot of times it's so amazing to me where people will come in and there's like litanies of complaints and what I call
Mhm.
case making for how the other
Mhm.
person is a failure or a terrible person. Lots of
Mhm.
examples.
Mhm.
And then I ask, well, what is it that you want? And they
Mhm.
don't know.
Mm.
They
Yeah.
can't say this. Well, what I want is for you to do this, or what I want
Mhm.
is for me to be able to do that. They don't
Mhm.
know because they're so
Mhm.
busy complaining and in that adrenaline that gets
Mhm.
going of that. So,
Mhm.
we kind of try to let the level of adrenaline not reach the point of no return, and have
Right.
people practice skills of calming down,
Mhm.
slowing down. And
Mhm.
so one of the other certifications is with Holly Young Eisendrath's voice dialogue therapy.
Okay. Mhm.
And what's interesting about dialogue therapy, for those of our listeners that are trained in Imago, which is another really good couples therapy,
Mhm.
Imago Couples Therapy, um, the originator of that therapy went to a workshop with Polly Young Eisendrath and her husband, Ed Epstein, where they
Mhm.
were originating this model that has become pretty much the Imago model.
Mhm.
And Polly is a very dear soul. The reason I was drawn to her work is because she's also a Jungian analyst, and you're aware that I am very interested in Jungian psychology.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I read two books of hers a long time ago. One of them was called Hags and Heroes,
Mhm.
and it was a Jungian approach to couples therapy and sort of looking at things through an archetypal lens. And then she wrote a later book, which is brilliant, called You're Not What I Expected,
Mhm.
and which is true of every relationship.
Right.
Every
Yep.
single relationship. You are not what I expected, because I was projecting all sorts of things at the beginning and imagining and hoping. And now I'm like facing the real person, and it's a little
Right.
scary. So
Mhm.
she developed this wonderful process of having people look face to face And things that have become part of the general wisdom of communication. But the purpose of this was to slow conversations down and for
Mhm,
people to start to recognize their projections and how what
mhm,
they were projecting was not really true in the other person's world.
mhm,
So it's this really structured dialogue where one person speaks in I language for themselves,
mhm,
not blaming, shaming, accusing, but for
mhm,
themselves. This is what I'm experiencing. And then the other person reflects it back as if, this is what I think you said.
mhm,
And it's not, I heard you say, like a parrot. It's like,
mhm,
this is what I think you were trying to get across.
mhm,
And then
mhm,
did I get it? And
mhm,
so, it's the imago dialogue, but it's the earlier
mhm,
form. And
mhm,
then the person can say, and it's amazing to me where
mhm,
I'll be working with couples and somebody will say something and the other person will say, I understand. And then I'll
mhm.
say, tell them what you understand. And then they
Yeah,
say something that has nothing to do with what the person says.
and it's like,
And
okay.
this is why they
Yeah,
get in trouble, is because
yeah,
people
absolutely.
say, I hear you, I
Mhm,
understand, I get it. But they don't ever
mhm,
say what they get, and it's sometimes
mhm.
way off. So the
Exactly.
process is actually going back and forth until the person actually feels gotten.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I like how you say when they okay, go ahead. Then I want to circle back
In
to you. Yeah.
Imago, they've added
Mhm.
something, and I
Yeah.
really like this. It's, I can understand how you would feel that way
Yeah.
because of what I understand about you. That's a
Hmm.
really good addition. And that comes from
Yes.
Imago.
That comes from Imago.
Yeah.
Can you mind spelling that so we can Imago?
IMAGO,
Yeah. Okay.
and it's
Okay.
Harville Hendricks and Helen Blakely Hunt.
Okay.
So yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
it's getting the love you want and
Hmm.
keeping the love you have. They have a series of books, but Getting the Love You Want is the original, really beautiful book. And he
Yeah.
also talks about how we get into relationships to heal childhood wounds. And then when our partner doesn't heal them, we get really upset and angry.
Mm, oh, yeah, yeah. I can definitely see that. When that, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, since I work a lot with like children and teens and also with the school system, a lot of the things we try to talk about is the importance of people. In this case, we talk a lot about kids, but adults, any human, to feel seen and heard and understood and all that. Would you say in that work that you're just describing, is that in and of itself regulating? When
Yes.
somebody feels heard and seen and not like they get me. Okay.
When someone feels heard and seen, they calm down. They
Okay.
just do. And it can be profoundly healing.
Mm,
Because
mm,
if I feel like my partner sees something about me that's never really been understood before,
mm,
and not
mm,
only does he or she see that in me, but they really get it, and it's okay, and they just get it. They either let it be, or
mhm,
but they certainly don't judge it. They're kind of
mhm,
like, I understand now. I
mhm,
understand now. And that
mhm,
doesn't mean that I'm excused from bad behavior just because I have this history or
mhm,
this thing, whatever it is. But it
mhm,
does mean that someone understanding it, just being seen in that way and not judged, is profoundly healing.
mhm.
People move
Wow.
forward from that because
Yeah.
then the
Yeah.
shame comes off of it.
Yes. 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 And that's a barrier. What you say it's a barrier to healing and healthy relationships is all that shame that we can carry with us. Wow. It's so healing. I mean, Chelsea, honestly, I'm gonna be honest. We could be here the rest of this Sunday just talking this because I love this. I think it's so I think one of the reasons why I find relationships so interesting is especially like intimate relationships is because in them it's like we start to see ourselves. Like you say, it's probably no other relationships or very few relationships other than and we could probably have a separate talk where we're talking about the parent-child relationship that can help us see ourselves. But this is one of those relationships where you're really starting to see yourself. So I think is a lot of work that can be done if people abide by those 6 C's you talked about. If they have the curiosity, if they have the courage and all the things and the commitment, it's a lot of growth that could come from that. And ultimately, I feel like get people closer to be able to birth their gifts. So that's why it's so much that I find so fascinating and helpful in this conversation. If people are listening, they saying, you know what, I want to connect more with what Dr. Wakefield is doing. I want to read her books. I want to see if she doing some classes or workshops. And if so, I want to go. Where can people find out more about what you're doing?
I have a website, chelseawakefield.com.
Okay.
And depending on how you'd like to connect with me, whether you'd like to, there's a section there that says train with me, just contact me and I'll get you on a mailing list and I'll let you know when the upcoming classes that I do, because I do train outside of UAMS where I also
Mm,
teach, but I
okay.
train outside of that. And if you're interested in a Luminous Woman Weekend and finding out, more about it, what it means to be a fully enfranchised, fully expressing, grounded, creative woman, come and do a Luminous Woman Weekend. We've got one coming up in Little Rock, September 29th, 30th, and October 1st at the Nest.
Okay.
So it's not up, the registration's not up today, but it'll be up soon.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that possibility. And if you want to come and do some couples work with me, contact me through my website. And I also have a program called Love Strategies for Stronger Relationships on the website, which is asynchronous learning. You can learn at your pace. So that's something that you can do before you even come in to see me for couples therapy.
Man, that's wonderful. Thank you. So if you don't mind spelling out chelseawakefield.com, how do you spell, if you could just spell that out for our listeners? Yeah.
CHELSEAWAKEFIELD. Chelsea
Okay.
Wakefield. Yeah.
chelseawakefield.com. All right. Excellent. Excellent. What's next? Well, let me just, before I ask you that, I'm just going to encourage once again, people go out there, go to the website, look up her books, be a part of the weekends and everything that she do. I want to say books because you have more than one. I know we've talked about
I
one, but I know
have
you have one.
I have 3 books. I also have 2
Mhm.
podcasts. I had the podcast that I did Love in the Time of COVID during
Mhm.
COVID, which has got a lot of great information. And I've got a whole podcast on Labyrinth of Love, the last book.
Yeah. Okay.
My other
Yeah.
2 books, my first book was called Negotiating the Inner Peace Treaty. It was about
Yes.
working with the inner self system. My
Mhm.
second book, which is a little bit more of a clinical book, is called In Search of Aphrodite. And that was really looking at women's sexuality, which has been an
Mhm.
area of great interest to me for many years.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I've said I was going to come back to that. I think we got to, if you have just a few more minutes, if you could, and I don't even know if you can say that in a few minutes, but from a process standpoint, if you could say what made you even get into, from a research perspective or even clinical, about sexuality, why is that important? Why do we need to be concerned with that in the way that you've studied it?
Well, first of all, if you work with couples, you know that couples have a lot of trouble with sex.
Okay.
So I decided that it was important to go get some significant training in that area.
Hmm.
And so I am an ASEC certified sex therapist, and that I learned so much in the process of that. And it became the focus of my PhD dissertation, which was women's sexual desire, which I have been really interested in for a long time. And I'm actually about to publish in a jury journal, a clinical journal, my model of working with women's sexual desire. So that's like a whole new thing. But the
Wow.
Wakefield model of working with that is, well, we could do a whole session on it. But
Mm.
here's the thing:
Okay.
our sexuality, particularly with women, has been largely interfered with by all sorts of things that, in our religious training, in our culture, in just a lack of education. I
Mhm.
was thinking today before we did this that I was just reflecting back on my early years and really realizing that I didn't even know how to have sex when I was first starting to have sex. I really didn't.
Mhm.
And I just thinking back on the problems. And then in my second marriage, fortunately, I married someone who was a good lover and very sensitive and compassionate. And I was able to kind of blossom into what became a really fulfilling sex life. But not
Mhm.
everybody has that good luck. And so in
Mhm.
working with people and with women, it's just been a really strong area of interest for me, is opening that world and what's possible in it if you get the right kind of couple dynamics going, if you get rid of the toxic history, if you heal the wounds of, terrible things that happened in the past, if you actually learn about it and get curious about it and start to value it, and then the couple starts to co-create, there's that
Mm,
creativity word,
yes.
a
Mm,
sex life worth being in. So how do you go about doing that, relational ways? I'm really actually mostly interested in long-term sexuality in couples. That's my major focus. But anyway, that's just a little bit about that. And the book
mm,
In Search of Aphrodite really looks at women's sexuality through an
mhm,
archetypal lens and
mhm,
the vast array of places that we can come into sexuality from. And I talk
mhm,
about having a sexual homeland, but then I also talk about having a little passport
mhm,
where you can go visit your partner's sexuality. You don't have to live
mhm,
there, but you can at least learn
mhm,
about it. And
mhm,
then learning what your sexual essence is. So you see the little
mhm,
theme about, people's essence that travels through all
mhm.
of my work. So
I
that's just a
see.
little taste of some of that.
Yeah, yeah, I can tell it's so much more that you have to offer with it. But thanks for talking about the book and talking about the different opportunities that you provide for people to learn more about it. I think it's just a couple of more questions I have. I just have to ask this one
That's sure.
before we wrap up. One, I want to connect the conversation about sexuality back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of people's inner world aligning with what's going on externally and like them really developing a life for themselves where they're birthing their gifts, where they're in their calling. Like, how would you say sexuality is or is not kind of related to that conversation?
I think we have terrible sex education in this country, and we have
Mm,
terrible sex education in our religious institutions.
mm,
And so the idea that sex is an important part of relationships and that two people have to learn how to be sexual partners.
mhm,
And the way that we've toxified sex with media and pornography and the fact that a lot of young people now get their sex education through pornography and they don't realize that this is adult, it's entertainment. This is not
mm.
actually how humans have sex.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of misinformation about the tenderness and the humanity of what it means to have sex in a long-term relationship and how you go about navigating all of that, like,
Mm,
setting it up so that it's not this people get into no-fly zones, which is a whole
mhm,
thing I could talk about, where they figure out what's safe that the two of them
mhm,
can do together, because if they expand beyond it, they get too anxious and they can't
mm,
talk about it. But rarely have I
mhm,
found a couple that can really, really talk about sex comfortably and
mm.
exchange
Right,
information without somebody getting upset. And
right.
so being able to talk about it from a stance of curiosity
Mhm,
and courage and compassion, and
mhm,
to be able to navigate that over the course of a lifetime, where you've got changes in health and you've got periods of time when you've got a bunch of little kids running around, and then empty nest and
yeah.
retirement. And I'm writing a chapter right now on late life sexuality. It's like,
Um,
do we
mm,
really help people who want to have a meaningful sexual relationship after they're 65 years old? How are we helping
mhm,
them? Are physicians talking to them?
right.
That whole thing. So um, it's actually a really interesting area to study in, and
Mhm,
it's very tender and it's very profound.
mhm,
And so I provide a lot of basic sex education, but I also talk about meaning, because sex
mhm,
is not just about behaviors. Sex is highly
mhm,
symbolic. It meets a
mhm,
lot of needs. It stirs up a lot of feelings, and it has a lot of meaning. So let's talk about the meaning and the needs that it meets and doesn't meet, and who you are in
mhm,
this story, and who you'd like to be instead of who you are, and
mhm,
what kind of courage it would need for you to actually, wander out into something more.
mhm. Okay. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Wakefield. You've dropped several gems today as we kind of talked about, of course, your knowledge base, but then also your process as well. So you talked about kind of what's coming up next with I'm just looking at my notes here, the Luminous Woman, September 29th through October the 1st. We can find out more about that on your website as time moves along. Um, as you think about I guess, chapter for you? I know that's coming up later this year, but as a next chapter, is it anything else that you see kind of coming down the pike for you in your process of birthing your gifts?
Well, you were talking about earlier how much this information needs to get out into the community. And I've been thinking a lot about that. So I really do want to do more teaching out in the community
Mhm.
to get some really important information out so that couples can see each other through a different lens and understand each other differently and not take things so personally and be more
Mhm.
collaborative in terms of working together to co-create a relationship worth being in with skills and capacities. So that's of high interest to me.
Okay, excellent. Well, everybody needs to stay tuned for that. That's what I'm just going to encourage you. Stay tuned, stay tuned. Is it anything that I haven't asked you about today that you've been thinking about and reflecting on in preparation for this that you wanted to be sure to share?
I think we've covered a pretty wide gamut. And I just want to say that I'm always so enjoy our conversations and
Same.
the work that you're doing. And I think this whole project that you're involved in with birthing the gift is very important.
Hmm. Thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that. Same here. I very much enjoy our conversations. I feel like I'm in a conversation with you when you're presenting. So I feel like we've had several conversations, but I definitely enjoyed our one-on-one conversation as well. So it has been another edition of Birthing the Gifts. It's a process conversation series. Thank you again, Dr. Wakefield, for joining us. I appreciate your time and expertise today.